So, it's the early 1700s and the Bourbons of France are broke, or as close to broke as you could be for the ruling class family. They had spent all of their money on expeditions, so by the time they found places, they didn't really have money to develop the places like they want to. Specifically, this one land in a swampy area that everybody said was too horrible of condition to build anything upon, which really sucked because they wanted this area because the way that it flowed along the Mississippi River would give them lots of access to multiple different areas. So for them, they were like, this would be great if we could build land here, but everybody was like, no, it can't happen. That was until 1717 when a man named John Law came along, and John Law was like, hey, you guys, I can totally make it happen in this place for you. I could get you like 6,000 people. I could get you 3,000 workers to help build the city, and best of all, it would only take me like 10 years. By 1727, it'll be a bustling city with tons of people. And John was telling them all sorts of things like, oh yeah, there are gonna be gold mines out there and silver mines. It's gonna be crazy, and pearls. You guys, there's gonna be so much wealth out there. And they were like, bet, say less, that's great. And I know for some people who don't have a grasp on history, they might be like, oh, I know that they had gold mines in like the West, but I know they had gold mines out in Louisiana or New Orleans. They don't, but we'll get back to that. And best of all, with this deal, the French would still be able to have control over the government rules, and it would still be ran like a French city. And for John, it was really good because he would get to have authority over how this place was built, ran, and all the people who were put in positions of power, which means that everybody who John knew and who he was cool with, he was hiring. He was like, oh yeah, that's my cousin. He's gonna be like the city council runner, and oh yeah, that's my stepmama. They're gonna get to be like the head of state for the treasury. And it worked like this for all but Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, and they became governor and commander of the region. And it was because he lived in the region for over 20 years that he not only was really perfect for John's plan, but he also knew that John was either really confused or really full of it, because in the entire time that Bienville had lived in that region, he had never seen any gold or silver mines, so he knew there were no gold or silver mines. And then also, he knew that the few pearls that John was also talking about they'd be able to find, they were like, no. So he already knew that something was kind of fishy, and he wasn't sure about John completely. He even told as much to the officials who were like saying, hey, do you want this job? He's like, yeah, this job sounds good, but just so you guys know, I think this guy's full of it and he's not gonna be able to make all this happen. But they were just like, no, we really think he's on the up and up. He sounds like a great guy, so do you want the job or not? And because Bienville, again, had lived in the region for over 20 years and he really wanted to make the area a great place, he was like, you know what? Yeah, sure, I'll take the job. But in the back of his mind, he's like, I'm gonna keep my eye on this John guy because he's a little sus. I'm gonna make a note of that. John is super sus. Great. But he still ended up taking the job because, again, he wanted to make the city a great place, and this was a great opportunity. So even though he knew that the gold and silver thing was a bunch of crap, he was like, maybe John just really wants to make this city a great place, and I'm just like suspicious because I know he's lying about some things. But whatever his reasons, as long as he's gonna make the city a great place, that's great. So with that, Bienville was appointed to his new job, and in 1718, he, along with over 25 convicts, carpenters, and pretty much anybody willing to go, went out to the new area, the new settlement, which would now be known as New Orleans in honor of the Duke of Orleans. And they just went to clearing the land and just overall trying to build and make the land a really nice place. Also, side note, I know it can confuse people because if you look up who founded New Orleans, you might get like 3 answers. This is because they kind of sort of have 3 answers to the question. So in 1682, a man named Robert Corval LaSalle ended up finding a settlement that would become known as Louisiana in honor of the king of France at the time, who was King Louis, so Louisiana. And then in 1699, a man named Pierre Le Moyne de Iberville ended up finding the colony. And then in 1718, along with John Law's plan, after being appointed, Bienville then founded New Orleans in 1718. So that's why there's like 3 different answers. Does that make sense? Great. But back to the main story. Bienville, having lived in the city for over 20 years, was writing back to the officials like, oh, it's great here, like the climate's great, everything's great, because again, he wants to get things working, he wants to keep them placated and happy. But all of the other French officials who had just recently moved there was like, nah, this ain't it. It's too humid, it's too muggy, there's too many mosquitoes, there's alligators everywhere, there's crayfish everywhere, like we don't know what to do with all of these things. Later on, we would figure out that we could just eat them. Problem solved, just eat it. You'll be good. But at the time, they weren't thinking like that. They were just like, this is gross. This is gross. I don't like this. I don't like this. But still, work had to go on. So a year into it, work was slow and not really eventful because of the aforementioned heat, again, for one, and also the rising and falling waters because they're in a swamp. They're in a swamp. They're trying to build places in a hot, muggy swamp filled with alligators, so progress was really slow. But while Bienville had his own struggle building up the city and making it into anything at all, John had his own part of his little plan scheme to work out because, as I said back at the start, he had promised his investors in his company that he was going to get this place up and running and looking great by 1727, and it's already a year into it. Things are moving kind of slow, so he has less than 10 years now, almost less than 8 years to make his plan happen. So he comes up with a scheme to get more people into the city because he's like, we need more people, and I told him we were going to get more people, and right now it's not happening, and we need more workers too, so we gotta do something. So what he did was he said, hey, government, newly appointed government, we need to get some people and we need to get the numbers of this city up, but nobody wants to come here. So great plan. Let's go to the prisons, the hospitals, let's find disgraced soldiers or soldiers that are just unruly, and let's force them to come to this new settlement. Huh? So they did just that, and in a lot of cases they were even going to, again, prisons and being like, hey, you can either finish out your sentence in this jail cell or you can move to New Orleans and have a free life, have riches, and have just have a great easy life with riches in New Orleans and be free. You know, best of all, be free. And they were like, yeah, sounds great. I guess I'm moving to New Orleans. So with that, John got over 300 willing immigrants and double that number in suspicious convicts, suspicious soldiers, and just all around suspicious people. But he brought a lot of people to the city with this plan. So, you know, you take the good, you take the bad. At least they got the population up. And this worked out great for about 2 years until the guys that looked around were like, hey guys, this is kind of a sausage fest, isn't it? Like, there's not a lot of chicks. Where's the chicks, man? The chicks! So Bienville ended up writing to the French government and being like, hey you guys, like, it's the worst here. Like, right now the white settlers are being forced to chase after these Native American girls. So the French government was like, oh my gosh, that sounds so horrible for those white settlers. Like, we need to get them some white women to force themselves on. We have a prison full of prostitutes and we don't know what to do with them. You need women, so win-win. And once again, they pretty much went with the same offer to the women of, hey, ladies of the night, you can either continue to spend your sentence here in this cell for the foreseeable future, or you can become colonists in New Orleans. And so they were like, yeah, no, New Orleans sounds great. I've always wanted to visit there, live there. Like, so with that, Dear John Law solved another problem. But if you're doing the math, at this point now, the city of New Orleans has about like 300-400 like regular immigrants, and then like everybody else in this city of over 1,000 people now is basically criminals, delinquents, hoodlums, ladies of the night. So obviously the investors start to take notice and they're like, hey, this city's starting to look it's looking a mess. It's looking kind of a mess. So what's going on here? And because, again, John Law is the top authority, even though Bienville already from the start was like, hey, this sounds sus, I don't think this can happen, I think he's kind of blowing smoke, in the end, they were like, hey, what's the cause of this problem, John? And John was like, oh, yeah, it's Bienville's fault. And Bienville's just like, well, shit. But the worst punishment wasn't really that bad for Bienville because all they did was get a new guy in power to basically be the
overseer governor.
Editing me, my phone and my camera missed somehow. Maybe I just went crazy, and because I would rehearse the script so many times, I just remember talking about it. But anyway, right after John Law basically blamed everything on Bienville, but right before he left, John was in the midst of working something called Code Noir, or Code Black. Basically, it was a enhanced version of the laws that were already put in place for enslaved people, but it kind of made things better in some ways, also weird in some ways. Obviously, it's a crappy situation all around, but the changes that he made to the Black Code that ended up getting enforced all over the states actually did have some better things. Like, on one hand, while as with most places, slaves who tried to run away could be punished, on the other hand, the enslavers who tried to punish them or punish them without just cause, like if they just punished them just because they wanted to, because they were cruel back then, they could actually be fined or even jailed back then. So it made it better for them in that way. But one of the weird things that was changed was, like, Jewish people had to be basically put out, and you couldn't worship anybody but Catholicism at that point, which isn't too weird because they were enforcing that really bad. But that was one of the other weird ones. Another one that was kind of pointless and silly was that at the time, they were basically saying no intermingling of the races, which is funny because even before this law and after this law, the enslavers were still forcing themselves on these women, which is how Creole came to be, or the mixed race with a bunch of things, but a lot of times it can be black and white. And this is because, again, these French settlers were forcing themselves on these enslaved people, so they had lots of Creole kids. But another good thing, too, about the Black Code was that you could free your enslaved people, and then they would basically have the rights of a free person. So this was also beneficial to the enslavers who would get these people pregnant and have these Creole kids, because then they could in turn just be like, hey, I know this kid looks like me, but they're not my kid. I just want to free them. So I have that right. So they're free now. So this is how a lot of the enslavers would free their children that they knew were their children. And even though the law was in place, at the time, they didn't have DNA testing. So even though these kids look like a tan version of these white enslavers, they're like, I don't know what to tell you. It's not my kid, but I want them to be free for reasons that are my own. They were just like, okay. So it was good and bad in some weird ways, but it was what it was. There were already laws at the time, so considering what things were beforehand, it did improve things in some way, but again, some things were just weird again. But now back to the regularly scheduled program. And after this code was enacted by New Orleans, it actually got enacted statewide after Louisiana was purchased by the U.S. later down the line. However, after this was done, so was Bienville, because he was sick of the fact that people were blaming him for stuff and demoting him and making him feel like all these problems was his problem. So he was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go back to France and just call it a day. So in 1724, Bienville was like, peace out. And after that, the city just started to go to crap. But before it started to go really downhill, things started to get a little bit better, because in 1727 the city had another population double, and it started to get more people. And with this also came the Ursuline nuns, who brought schools and hospitals, and they also brought young women from France to get married to these prospective gentlemen out here. So even more people, even more city, even more brides. These girls became later known as the casket girls, because when the company sent them over, they sent them with these little boxes of provisions, hats, clothes, everything that they would need for their new journey, and they looked like little caskets. So casket girls. But also the casket girls were known to be very, very fertile, like super fertile. The streetwalkers that they brought to the city pretty much didn't have kids. Not only probably because they weren't infertile, because they were probably just like, we're having fun in the city, we don't want to be bothered with kids, we just want to live our best life. But the casket girls, on the other hand, were super fertile, and to like each one girl, they had like on average like 100 kids. And each of those 100 kids had hundreds of kids. And that's why it's believed that if you're native to New Orleans, you can trace your lineage back to one of the original casket girls, because they were just popping out babies like left and right. And even though again it was in 1727 and the city had been founded a few years beforehand, and women had come in like 7 years earlier, most of those women that came in weren't given birth like the casket girls were. However, this was the last of the good things to happen at the time, because in 1729 things got heated. When the land was first founded, there were obviously Native American people there. Intentions were high the entire time, but Bienville was thankfully able to keep them pretty happy and be respectful to them through this transition process. But when Bienville was gone, the Natchez in 1729, invaded the fort in Natchez and ended up 250 men and kidnapped over 450 women, children, and enslaved people. And a lot of people were afraid New Orleans was next. And aside from that, there was tons of political unrest just in the city in general because of like the aforementioned not so great people that got put into power by John Law originally. So the people were just basically saying like, we need to, this colony's a bust. This colony's a bust. Like, they already have disreputable people in this city, and now they having these issues with these Native American people. Like, this just does not seem worth it. So in the end, the French people were pressured into basically just like dissolving it, and John Law's company with that. And in doing so, they discovered that basically, like Bienville had said, it had been a scam the whole time. John had basically been taking the money that they were giving him and investing it mostly into his company. He was getting people, but he was making promises to everybody but not paying them up. Again, he mentioned to the French people, hey, there's gold mines, there's silver mines out here, like you'll get tons of money back in return, but there were no gold and silver mines. And again, the pearls worth nothing. And then he was telling the people that he brought to the city, hey, you guys, like it's great, like there's tons of money out here, there's tons of opportunity out here. And then the people get there and it's like, there's nothing but shacks out here, and you said there was gold and silver, but there's no gold and silver, and you're saying we have to work. And again, because most of them were criminals and bootleggers and stuff, when they couldn't find money in gold mines like they were told they could or have an easy life, they started to get money the way that they knew how to get money, which was bust up the city, steal, rob. So crime was flourishing and started to go really out of hand. So after 1729, the Native Americans attacked that fort. The investors were, and seeing what John Law was up to, who do you think they called? Not Ghostbusters. They rang up Bienville and was like, hey Bienville, can you, oh actually they didn't even have phones back then. They were like, hey Bienville, sorry about that, can you come to us? Cool. I think they had pigeons, I don't know, but like they sent that off and John got the pigeon to know and he was like, I guess I'll come back. Cool. And he ended up going back in 1733. And for the next 10 years, he did his thing again, trying to help build up the city, trying to make it better, despite getting all the blame. He tried to do his part to make the city better, even though they had still the main challenges being in a swampy area. The weather was horrible. They had constant hurricanes happening, and they also had constant flooding happening with that. And then they also had issues like wild dogs in 1735 that they had to combat. But for the most part, he did what he could, and he kept things running as best he could and got things in a somewhat better position over the next 10 years that he was in governor, or that he was the governor. But then in 1743 he decided to retire because he was just tired from doing all the work that he had been doing. Fair enough, like he had been doing a lot of work. So with that, he ended up appointing a new governor to take over in his place, the Marquis de Verdigueux. I'm gonna put it on the screen. It's irrelevant because it was a bad choice. He was a bad choice. As most marquises go, he was cool in that he wanted to bring culture and color and fun to the city, but he was bad in that he was corrupt and down bad. Like he was totally down with the corruption, starting with appointing his family to high positions that gave them like chokeholds on all the city's finances and everything, and in exchange he would get cuts of everything they were taking from everybody. And so he was having a blast and everything was great for him, because while bootlegging and crimes and things were going again out of hand and getting worse, even though Bienville had made things better, they still weren't great. And under the Marquis, they started to get worse again because he was super lax. He didn't care because, again, he's getting a cut out of all these pies. So he's just walking around the city having parties, having a great time, like, hey, how you doing? Oh no, you're getting robbed. Who's this bootlegger? Show me them. Oh, that's my cousin. Yeah, and I'm getting a cut from my cousin. So that's not a problem at all. Oh, hey, how's it going? Great. How you doing? Oh, there's a prostitute run. Who's that? That's my aunt. So that's your problem, not my problem. Great, everything's going great, cool. So for years, the Marquis was just like letting crime get worse and worse, and it was getting worse for the whole city as a whole. But again, he was getting his cut, so no problem, right? Well, a few years later, like 6 to 7 years. In 1750, the worst happened, you guys. The money that he got from bootleggers and counterfeiters and convicts turned out to be fake. Go figure. So the Marquis, who the whole time was like, fine, no problem, everything's great. He was now that he knew that his money was affected, he was like, no ma'am, no ma'am, no ma'am, not my money. Like, this is a problem. It wasn't a problem when other people were affected, but now it's affecting the people that matter, aka me. This is a problem. We need to fix this. We need to do everything we can to make this right again. So in 1750, he makes an investigation to try to find these counterfeiters and bootleggers. Most of them were able to get away, pretty much all of them except for one free man of color, because of course that's the one person that they managed to catch. As punishment to this person who allegedly was one of the counterfeiters, but the times being the times, it was probably just a free man of color and they needed somebody to blame, so they were just like, that guy. Yeah, him. He's a free man of color and he's loitering it in our faces. It's him. He must be him. So, to punish him, they ended up flogging him, re-enslaving him, and branding him with the fleur-de-lis. Side note again, this is why a lot of people don't really care for the fleur-de-lis, or at least people that know their history of the city don't care for the fleur-de-lis. Much like the swastika, unfortunately, it was a symbol that was pre-opted from someone else. They already had the fleur-de-lis at the time. It was kind of like the royal family symbol. Then it kind of became the symbol of the city. However, enslavers decided that they would use this mark to brand people who ran away, to not only let them know like this is your punishment, but to also let future enslavers know, hey, this person's a problem, they're probably going to run away. So because of that, it became kind of known negatively too in the city. But again, like the swastika, unfortunately, that was co-opted by it had Buddhist meanings before that, but then got turned bad. So you know, I kind of understand both sides of it. So, you know, for people that have a tattoo of the fleur-de-lis and their friends are like, hey, cool tattoo. So let me tell you a story about my great-great-great-grandfather who was enslaved and tried to run away. I get why they're, you know, would be like, feel away. But again, it used to be good. It's not really anybody's fault that it got turned bad. Well, it's the enslaver's fault, but you know what I'm saying. Like, it's bad, but that's why people don't like it. But, you know, if you have the tattoo, don't feel bad. It looks nice. It's still used in the city now, so But that being said, they only got to catch one of the culprits involved. But because of that, the Marquis now was like, I can't be letting things slide like this. Like, these booze, this bootlegging, these prostitutes, like, this all has to be locked down. So in 1751, the next year, he started to lock things down more. But as most people know, Prohibition, even after it happened, the city was still doing their dirt under everybody's nose. It's just like, no, we don't have any. What? No, we don't know about any. That's my medicine. It's just my medicine. Everything's great. So they managed to get away with it real easy. And then on top of that, only 2 years later, the Marquis ended up becoming governor of Canada and peaced out. So nothing really changed that much. So because the Marquis left, we got a new governor in the form of Louis Boulard de Carlac. It's up here. He actually was a good guy though, so he ended up getting a street named after him too, so take a shot. But despite being a really good guy and overall good mayor, the problem was the aforementioned years of corruption and people being put in power that were corrupt. So when Carolyn came in, was like, wow, you guys, there's so much corruption in this city. We have got to do something about all of this corruption, these bootleggers, these prostitutes, like everybody's like running scams, like this has to change. He was telling it to the people that were getting a cut from this and like secretly running it. So they were like, yeah, no, we don't agree with that. Everything's just fine. It's just fine. We don't want anything to change. But thank you. And on top of that making his life hard, he also had to deal with the French and Indian War, which is currently going on outside of the city. And because of this, the city also wasn't really getting much attention. In fact, for a 4-year span, the French people were not sending New Orleans anything because they were focused on the war out there, and they didn't want to be bothered with New Orleans because it was like one of the few places in the States, and they were more focused on like the European side of things. So they just weren't sending ships out to New Orleans. And if not for the British governor of Jamaica, who was secretly sending New Orleans goods, the city would probably have starved to death then and there. But thankfully, the French lost the war, and they ended up signing a treaty which ended up making things a little bit easier for the city. Ironically, when they lost the war in 1763 and signed this treaty, they ended up losing pretty much everything that they had in America except for the place that they were ignoring, like Louisiana and New Orleans specifically. So they ended up getting only New Orleans and Louisiana, but in a twist, they didn't actually even get New Orleans and Louisiana, because in another treaty they had signed a year prior called the Treaty of Fontainebleau, they had promised Louisiana and New Orleans to the Spanish, which the citizens of New Orleans did not even find out until 1764, a year later, when the French were like, yeah, so you guys are actually owned by the Spanish now. Bye! And soon the city was under control of Spanish governor Don Antonio de Yaula. In any case, 4 years later, he had gotten ran out of the city.
The Acadians and the French farmers who ended up moving during the French and Indian War to New Orleans because they were, again, told free land, happy space. But after the Spanish took over, they got word that the Spanish were planning to enslave the people that would now be known as the Cajuns. And the Cajuns were very proud people, and they were like, oh hell no, you're not about to enslave us. So over 600 of them would end up revolting in one of the first revolutions that the American continent would have. And yeah, they sent him back to Havana and was like, yeah, we did it. But they really didn't, because he ran back off to Havana, and Carlos of Spain was like, oh hell no, they're not about to run us off like that. So he sent back 2,600 mercenaries, led by a man named Don Alexander O'Reilly, later known as Bloody O'Reilly, because that's how he was getting down. They took the revolutionaries to a firing squad, they enforced census, they enforced taxes, they were doing bloody reigns of terror as people were known to do during those times. However, despite this horrible start to things and pretty much the citizens hating the Spanish rule, it actually benefited the city in the long run, because the Spanish, unlike the French, really weren't concerned with trying to make riches and getting rich. They were just concerned about getting the city and the people together. So they ended up helping to get more businesses going, they got more jobs going, and 20 years later, once again, the city's population had doubled again. And the city was starting to look more so like an actual city. They were really strict about crime, the corruptness. All the French people that were in power when the Spanish took over, they kicked them out of the council. They were like, nope, we're taking over all of these ruling seats. So the city was in really good standing overall and had lots of people. The only issue was that a lot of the city, again, having been built by the French, was really ramshackle looking. There was a lot of wooden buildings, there was a lot of tents, there was a lot of rushed together things, because again, the settlement was put together really rushed and haphazardly at the time. But later, 2 fires would happen in the city that would pretty much give it a reset on the architecture. One fire happened in 1788 when a chapel ended up catching fire because of a lit candle. Ironically, the chapel that was nearby was supposed to ring a bell, but because it happened on Good Friday, they refused to ring the bell because it was a holiday. Because of this, the fire ended up spreading quickly around the city before people had time to react, and burned down pretty much all of the Vieux Carré area up until what the levee was, including the chapel that refused to ring the bell because it was a holiday. So they won't let that happen again in the future, I imagine. The second fire happened in 1794 when 2 children on Royal Street who were playing with flint and steel for who knows what reason, but kids back then only had sticks and rocks to play with. So anyway, it caused a fire that ended up burning down a good deal of the city once again. After this, though, the city was able to get rebuilt really good, and it ended up getting lots of French architecture with bricks and tiles as opposed to the wood and sticks that they had before. So it was a horrible thing, but it was a silver lining in the end, since most of the Vieux Carré had ended up burning down. Another side note, the Vieux Carré stands for Old Square. This was because back in the day, when they first started to build the settlement, as years went on, Americans started to come into the area with their goods and everything. The French people found them to be brass, loud. They didn't care for them. They were just like, what? No coof, no coof. We don't like it. We don't be near us. So because of this, the Americans were like, okay, we don't want to rock with you anyway. So they ended up making their own section or side a little bit away from the Vieux Carré. Even though they found their own side, like there was constant like headbutting between the two sides. So in 1807, there was actually a bill that got signed to create what was called a neutral ground. It was basically it's now known as a median ground, but it was basically the line that separated the Vieux Carré side, or the French side, from the American side of the city. But, you know, again, in the end, most of the original Vieux Carré ended up burning down, but still, they wanted to have their own side. They wanted the other Americans to have their own side. And later, that neutral ground area was planned to be turned into a canal. But because times changed and plans changed, instead of being turned into a canal, they just ended up naming it Canal Street. So that's how we got Canal Street today, because people was beefing and wanted their own sides, and they wanted to put a whole canal between the two of them. But cities burn, people move on, and yeah. But even though, thanks to this unfortunate accident, the city got built better than ever with this new Spanish architecture, the French settlers were still hoping that things would just go back to being French.
And then in 1790, they got their hopes up really high because they heard that the French Revolution was happening, and they were like, oh yeah, in no time things will be great. And they got their hopes up even higher when in 1800 they heard that Napoleon was doing great and had won and even signed a treaty that was going to let the French take over New Orleans again. But because he was dealing with upheavals and stuff still, he was like, for now I'm just gonna let the Spanish keep controlling things and like keeping things how they are. But essentially New Orleans was going to be French territory again, so the French people were like, yay, this is great, it's finally happening. However, 4 years later, New Orleans would become American territory. For one, after the French Revolution, Napoleon needed money. And secondly, President Jefferson really wanted New Orleans because, as Alfred mentioned, the city was built where it was built because the river gave a lot of controls to a lot of places. And this is still the 1800s. So at this time, boats are still very much the way to transport and get around the place. So the Mississippi River through New Orleans gave access to multiple states and multiple trading posts with that. So the president really wanted to have access to New Orleans, and Louisiana also had really great resources too. So because of that, the president ended up purchasing Louisiana and all surrounding territories to get a hold of New Orleans, and this became known as the Louisiana Purchase. So with that, all the French people officially just gave up hope because it was like, okay, game over again. Game over, man, game over. And so, thanks to the intervention of the Spanish architecture and the U.S. purchase, we were able to get New Orleans to being the largest city in the South and the 5th largest city in the U.S. by 1810, which is really great. So now at a little under 100 years, New Orleans has been formed. It's finally on the upswing. It's finally getting out of the crime, but again, crime and everything, because of the way the city started, would plague the city for years to come. But at least at this point on, it has a better progressive start to being the city that it will later become. I hope this was at least mildly informative. It was fun for me because I enjoyed reading and learning and looking up all this stuff about all these things that happened in the city, and also piecing some of the puzzles together, because there are certain things that I knew and had learned, but things that had confused me, especially these French names. Like, some of them were so confusing to figure out. Like, I thought one of the names was actually 2 different people for a while, because like the names they have like 5 names at the time. But it was fun to learn and figure out and get these things together. But it's also interesting all the time to learn the new things about the city, to learn the things that I didn't know happened, the things that I knew happened, but learning new spins on them. So yeah, there are of course more years, but just doing the first 100 years-ish of the city. It's gonna be a long video. I don't know how long exactly, but it's at least gonna be 30 minutes to an hour long, so that's long enough, and I'll come back with more eras of New Orleans in the future. My name is Ronald, also known as Ron Orleans, and I have been your guide to the city for today. Bye. Also, there's definitely more stuff I can and will cover in the future. This video ended up being super long, just going over the stuff that I went through, but there was still tons of stuff that I didn't get to talk about that I want to talk about, so in the future I'll definitely cover them. I also have a lot of short form videos that explain things too, but some videos just need more clarification, like the Cajun and Creole differences and things like that, so that's why I'm doing the longer format videos too.